The acrid smell of developing chemicals hung thick in the darkroom air as Captain Hubert Prouvand lowered the photographic plate into the solution. It was September of 1936, and he and his assistant, Indra Shira, had just completed what should have been a routine architectural assignment for Country Life magazine. They were documenting the grand interiors of Raynham Hall in Norfolk, nothing more. The stately home's oak staircase had been their final shot of the day. Shira leaned closer as the image began to materialize in the developer tray, watching the familiar outlines of the wooden balustrade emerge from the chemical fog. Then something else appeared. Something that made both men freeze. Descending the staircase, where moments before there had been nothing but empty air, a translucent figure took shape on the negative. A woman, draped in flowing white, her features indistinct but unmistakably human in form, seemed to glide down the steps with an ethereal grace that defied every natural law they knew. Prouvand would later describe his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped the plate into the solution. This was impossible. They had been alone. Completely alone. Yet here, captured in silver halide crystals, was something that should not exist. Nearly 90 years have passed since that moment in the darkroom, and the question remains unanswered. Is this photograph the only truly authenticated image of a ghost, or is it the most elaborate and enduring hoax in paranormal history? Behind this single image lies a 300-year mystery, a tale of tragedy and terror that the walls of Raynham Hall have kept secret for generations. And despite decades of scrutiny from skeptics, scientists, and professional debunkers, the Brown Lady photograph has never been definitively explained away. The year 1619 marked a time when England's landed gentry sought to carve their legacies into the very landscape of the realm. In the flat, wind-swept expanse of Norfolk, where gray skies hung low over fields of barley and wheat, Sir Roger Townshend commissioned a house that would stand as testament to his family's ascending power. Raynham Hall rose from the Norfolk clay, not as a fortress, but as something far more ambitious. A palace of brick and stone that spoke of wealth, sophistication, and an unshakable belief in the permanence of dynasty. The architecture reflected the confident hand of the early 17th century. Red brick facades stretched across a commanding frontage, punctuated by towering chimneys that reached toward the perpetually clouded Norfolk heavens. Stone coins marked the corners with geometric precision, while rows of mullioned windows gazed out across carefully manicured grounds. This was not a house built for defense against invaders. This was a house built to intimidate through sheer magnificence, to announce to every passing traveler that within these walls resided a family of consequence. The Townshends were not merely wealthy landowners. They were architects of power itself, weaving themselves into the very fabric of British political life across the centuries. Charles Townshend, the second Viscount, would later earn the moniker Turnip Townshend for his revolutionary agricultural innovations, transforming Norfolk farming and, by extension, English agriculture itself. But it was his descendant, also named Charles, who would rise to become Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1766, his decisions echoing across the Atlantic to ignite rebellions in colonies that would become America. Power, however, demands its price, and Raynham Hall would exact payment in ways both subtle and profound. At the heart of this sprawling estate stood a feature that would, centuries later, become the focus of international fascination. The oak staircase commanded the central hall with an authority befitting its craftsmanship. Rising 3 full stories through the mansion's core, it was constructed entirely from English oak, each baluster turned by hand, each newel post carved with the confident flourishes of Jacobean artistry. The wood had darkened over the decades, absorbing centuries of beeswax polish until it gleamed with an almost liquid depth, rich browns bleeding into blacks in the shadows. The staircase existed in a peculiar state of isolation within the grand house. Unlike the public rooms where the family entertained visiting dignitaries and fellow aristocrats, this vertical passage occupied a space between the intimate and the ceremonial. Servants used it, certainly, their feet wearing gentle depressions into the center of each tread, but it also served as the primary route between the family's private chambers on the upper floors and the formal reception rooms below. Morning light filtered through tall windows on the landings, creating pools of pale illumination that only emphasized the gathering darkness in the turns and corners where the staircase twisted upward. The walls alongside the oak steps bore the accumulated weight of generations. Dark paneling absorbed what little light penetrated from the windows. Portrait after portrait of Townshend ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames, their eyes following anyone who dared ascend or descend. These painted faces wore the expressions of their era, some stern and unforgiving, others captured in moments of aristocratic ease, but all sharing that particular quality of Georgian and Stuart portraiture that suggested they were judging the living and finding them wanting. By night, the staircase transformed entirely. Candlelight could not penetrate the depths of that oak-paneled well. The shadows seemed to pool and gather, creating spaces of absolute darkness between the trembling circles of illumination. Servants whispered among themselves about the feeling of being watched when carrying candles up to the family bedchambers after dark. The house settled around them with groans and sighs, the old oak timbers expanding and contracting with the Norfolk dampness, creating sounds that could almost be mistaken for footsteps, for the rustle of heavy fabric, for breathing just beyond the reach of the light. The Townshend family, for all their political acumen and agricultural innovation, could not escape the patterns that seemed to govern aristocratic life in that era. Marriages were arranged for advantage rather than affection. Fortunes rose and fell based on royal favor. Scandals erupted and were suppressed with the ruthless efficiency that only great wealth could purchase. And in the quiet spaces between public triumph and private despair, stories began to accumulate. The first whispers of something amiss at Raynham Hall emerged in the 1700s, though the exact year remains lost to time. Guests visiting the estate began to report experiences that defied easy explanation. A woman, they said, had been seen in the corridors during the dark hours before dawn. She wore a dress of brown brocade, heavy and rich, the kind of garment that marked wealth and status. Her appearance was always the same. She would be glimpsed at the end of a hallway, or ascending the great staircase, or standing motionless in doorways. What made these accounts particularly unsettling was the consistency of detail. Independent witnesses, people who had never spoken to one another about their experiences, described the same figure. The brown brocade dress with its elaborate patterns, the way she seemed to glide rather than walk, as though her feet did not quite touch the floor, the absolute silence of her passage, and most disturbing of all, the state of her face. Some witnesses claimed they could not see her features clearly, as though a veil of shadow obscured them. Others insisted they had looked directly at her and seen nothing where a face should be, just darkness and the suggestion of empty sockets where eyes might have been. Still others spoke of a face that bore traces of profound suffering, eyes that wept without tears, a mouth frozen in an expression of eternal anguish. The servants knew, as servants always know. They traded stories in the kitchens and the servant quarters, away from the family's hearing. They spoke of cold spots in certain corridors where the temperature would plummet without explanation, even in summer. They mentioned doors that would not stay latched in particular rooms, opening slowly through the night despite being firmly closed and locked. They warned new staff members about the third-floor gallery, where the sensation of being followed was so overwhelming that even the bravest housemaid would run rather than walk through it after sunset. The Townshend family themselves maintained a careful public silence on such matters. Aristocrats of their standing did not speak openly of hauntings or supernatural disturbances. Such topics were beneath their dignity, the province of superstitious commoners and attention-seeking charlatans. Yet privately, family letters and journals hinted at experiences that troubled even the most skeptical members of the household. George Townshend, the first Marquess, was a man of considerable military and political achievement, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, who had served with distinction in the capture of Quebec. He was not given to flights of fancy or nervous imaginings. Yet in a letter to a close friend written in 1786, he made oblique reference to disturbances at Raynham Hall that had left even him unsettled. He wrote of sounds in the night that seemed to emanate from the oak staircase, of footsteps when no one was there, of his own unshakable feeling that the house harbored presences that defied rational explanation. The architecture of Raynham Hall itself seemed almost designed to nurture such phenomena. The house sprawled across its Norfolk grounds in a warren of interconnected wings and additions, each generation of Townshends adding their own modifications and expansion. This created a labyrinthine quality to the interior, where one could easily become disoriented, where corridors led to unexpected places, where the geometry of the structure seemed to shift depending on one's approach. The estate's isolation contributed to its atmosphere. Norfolk stretched away in all directions, flat and windswept, offering little shelter from the gales that swept in from the North Sea. In winter, fog rolled across the fields to envelop the house in gray obscurity, muffling sound and distorting perception. In those conditions, Raynham Hall seemed to float in nothingness, cut off from the world, existing in its own realm, where the normal rules might not apply. Wealth and tragedy had indeed intertwined across the generations at Raynham Hall, creating a tapestry of human experience that ranged from triumph to despair. The house bore witness to births and deaths, to marriages celebrated and marriages that became prisons, to children raised within its walls, who would go on to shape the destiny of nations, and to others who would die young and be buried in the family vault. The Brown Lady, as she came to be known, walked through all of it. She appeared to politicians and poets, to servants and members of the family itself. Her presence became woven into the very identity of Raynham Hall, an unspoken understanding that the house held secrets that predated any living occupant, that beneath the veneer of aristocratic privilege and power lay something older and more fundamental. As the centuries turned and the world beyond Norfolk transformed beyond recognition, Raynham Hall remained. The Townshend family endured, their influence waxing and waning with the tides of history. And within that grand house, with its oak staircase and portrait-lined walls, the woman in brown brocade continued her eternal rounds, waiting perhaps for something that would not come until a December night in 1936, when a camera would capture what the human eye had reported for more than 2 centuries. In the grand halls of 18th century England, where power and privilege masked the darkest of domestic tyrannies, one woman's fate became a cautionary tale whispered behind gloved hands and ornate fans. Her name was Dorothy Walpole, sister to Robert Walpole, who would rise to become Britain's first prime minister, and her story reminds us that even the most gilded cages can become tombs for the living. Dorothy Walpole was born into a world of extraordinary privilege and political ambition. The Walpole family represented the new aristocratic power of early Georgian England, their influence stretching from Norfolk's country estates to the corridors of Westminster. By all contemporary accounts, Dorothy embodied everything the age valued in a young woman of breeding, yet possessed a spirit that made her dangerous in an era when women were expected to be decorative and compliant. Those who knew her before her marriage described a vibrant creature, her beauty remarked upon in letters and diaries of the period. She possessed dark eyes that contemporaries noted could flash with intelligence and wit, qualities admired in drawing rooms but viewed with suspicion in a wife. Her hair, according to one account, fell in chestnut waves that caught the candlelight during evening gatherings. But it was her personality that truly set Dorothy apart from the parade of debutantes who graced London society. She was described as defiant, possessed of opinions she did not hesitate to express. In an age when women were taught to defer to male authority in all things, Dorothy Walpole had the audacity to think for herself, to engage in political discourse, to laugh too loudly and love too freely. These qualities would make her both celebrated and vulnerable. In 1713, Dorothy Walpole married Charles Townshend, and the match seemed to promise everything. Townshend was a rising political star, his ambitions matching those of Dorothy's own brother. The alliance between the Walpole and Townshend families represented a consolidation of power that would shape British politics for decades. Charles Townshend would eventually serve as Secretary of State, a man of considerable influence and even greater pride. For Dorothy, the marriage initially offered the kind of life she had been raised to expect. Mistress of grand estates, mother to future heirs, a woman of consequence in the rigid hierarchy of Georgian society. But somewhere in those early years the marriage soured. The historical record grows murky here, as it so often does when we approach the private sufferings of women whose stories were controlled by the men who imprisoned them. What we know comes from fragments, from whispered rumors that survived in letters and journals, from servants' accounts, and the carefully coded language of scandal. Dorothy Walpole, it was said, took a lover. His name was Lord Wharton, a man whose own reputation for rakish behavior was well established in London society. Philip Wharton, Duke of Wharton, was himself a controversial figure, a Jacobite sympathizer whose political allegiances made him a dangerous associate for the sister of an emerging prime minister. Whether Dorothy sought comfort in Wharton's arms because her marriage had already failed, or whether the affair itself destroyed whatever foundation existed between husband and wife, we cannot know with certainty. What followed, however, was documented with chilling clarity. Charles Townshend discovered the affair. The circumstances of the discovery vary depending on which account you believe. Some sources suggest intercepted letters, passionate correspondence that fell into the wrong hands. Others whisper of a more dramatic revelation, lovers discovered in a moment of intimacy that shattered any pretense of marital harmony. Regardless of how the truth emerged, Townshend's response revealed the absolute power husbands wielded over their wives in 18th century England, and the terrifying consequences when that power was wielded without mercy. Dorothy was removed from London society. No scandal reached the public, no whisper of divorce proceedings that might have tainted both families' reputations. Instead, Charles Townshend exercised a husband's prerogative in the most brutal way imaginable. He took Dorothy to Raynham Hall, the Townshend family seat in Norfolk, and there he made her disappear. Raynham Hall stands even today, a magnificent Palladian mansion set in the Norfolk countryside, its elegant proportions and classical symmetry speaking to the refined tastes of its builders. But within those beautiful walls, Dorothy Walpole vanished from the world. Townshend did not divorce her, divorce being both scandalous and difficult to obtain for men of his class. He did not send her to a convent on the continent, though this was a common enough solution for inconvenient wives. Instead, he imprisoned her in her own home. The accounts from this period paint a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Dorothy was confined to a remote section of Raynham Hall, kept from her children, denied visitors, erased from the social world she had once graced with her beauty and spirit. Servants who caught glimpses of her in those years reported a woman transformed by suffering. The vibrant Dorothy they had known, reduced to a ghost haunting her own prison. She was permitted no correspondence, no contact with her family, not even the comfort of seeing the children she had borne. Think for a moment about what such isolation means. Day after day, in the same rooms, watching the seasons change through windows that offered views of a world she could no longer touch. The sounds of the house continuing around her, dinners and gatherings and ordinary domestic life, while she remained locked away like a shameful secret. Her brother Robert had become one of the most powerful men in England, yet even his influence could not or would not secure her freedom. The rights of a husband were absolute, and Charles Townshend exercised those rights with methodical vengeance. Then in 1726, an announcement was made. Dorothy Walpole Townshend had died. The news was received with the appropriate expressions of sorrow, condolences offered to the grieving widower. But almost immediately, whispers began. Servants spoke of strange occurrences at Raynham Hall. Some claimed to have seen a woman in brown, walking the corridors where Dorothy had been confined. Others insisted they had heard sounds from the sealed apartments, footsteps, and soft crying in the dead of night. And there were those who claimed something more disturbing still. They whispered that Dorothy Walpole had not died in 1726 at all, that the funeral had been a fiction, a convenient way for Townshend to explain his wife's permanent absence from society, that Dorothy remained alive in her prison, year after year, while the world believed her dead and mourned and forgot her. According to these accounts, Dorothy actually died in 1740, 14 years after her supposed burial. 14 years of living death, of isolation so complete that the world had already moved on without her. By the time her heart finally stopped beating, she had been erased so thoroughly that her actual death went unrecorded, unmourned, unremarked upon. She died as she had lived those final years, alone and forgotten, a woman whose only crime had been to seek affection outside the bounds of a loveless marriage. The psychological dimensions of Dorothy's story reveal something profound about the mechanisms of power and control in Georgian England. Her imprisonment was perfectly legal, enacted by a husband who faced no consequences for his actions. The same society that celebrated reason and enlightenment, that was producing philosophy and art and scientific advancement, allowed a woman to be buried alive in her own home for the crime of adultery. While men of Townshend's class routinely kept mistresses with barely a nod to discretion, Dorothy's transgression was unforgivable, because it challenged her husband's absolute authority over her person, her body, her very existence. This is why ghost stories matter. They give voice to the silenced, presence to the heresy. Dorothy Walpole's spirit, according to legend, never left Raynham Hall. She became what witnesses would later call the Brown Lady, named for the brown brocade dress she wore in her most famous photographic appearance centuries later. But long before that photograph, servants and visitors reported encounters with a woman who walked the halls where Dorothy had been imprisoned. They described seeing her near the staircase, her face turned toward them with an expression of infinite sadness. Some reported that where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow sockets, as though even in death she could not bear to see the place of her suffering. Others claimed she appeared most often near the apartments where she had been confined, endlessly pacing the same paths she had walked during her imprisonment, unable to leave even after death had finally freed her from her husband's control. The Brown Lady has been witnessed by numerous credible observers over the centuries. In 1835, Colonel Loftus, a guest at Raynham Hall, reported seeing her on 2 consecutive nights, describing in detail her brown dress and the terrible absence where her eyes should have been. In 1936, a photographer from Country Life magazine captured what remains one of the most famous ghost photographs ever taken, an image that appears to show a woman descending the staircase, her form translucent, her features barely visible but unmistakably female. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Dorothy Walpole's story haunts us because it reveals a truth about power and its abuses that transcends the supernatural. She was a woman who dared to defy the strictures placed upon her, who sought happiness outside the bonds of duty and propriety, and who paid for that defiance with everything she was. Her imprisonment was not an aberration, but an accepted exercise of patriarchal authority, her suffering unremarkable to those who believed wives were property to be controlled absolutely. If Dorothy Walpole walks still through Raynham Hall, perhaps it is because some injustices are too profound to be resolved by death alone. Perhaps her spirit lingers because her story was never properly told, her suffering never acknowledged, her personhood never restored. In the Brown Lady, we see not just a ghost but a witness, a woman who refuses to be forgotten, whose presence insists that we remember what was done to her in the name of honor and masculine pride. The halls of Raynham Hall echo with more than footsteps. They echo with the question that Dorothy Walpole's fate demands we ask ourselves. How many women were erased from history, their stories controlled by the men who oppressed them, their voices silenced so completely that only legends remain? And what does it say about us that we find their ghosts more believable than the documented cruelties that created them? Warren Raro. The Christmas season of 1835 brought no joy to Raynham Hall. The grand estate, draped in its winter finery, hosted the usual gathering of nobility and distinguished guests. Among them was Colonel Loftus, a man whose military career had taken him across continents, who had witnessed the brutality of war and the fragility of human life. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural delusions. Yet, what he would witness during those cold December nights would shake the very foundation of his rational worldview. On the first night, as the hour approached 1 in the morning, Colonel Loftus found himself unable to sleep. The guest quarters at Raynham Hall, while luxurious, felt oppressively cold despite the fire that burned in the grate. He decided to walk the corridors, perhaps to shake off the strange unease that had settled over him. As he turned a corner near the grand staircase, he saw her. A woman in a brown brocade dress stood before him, luminous in the darkness. The dress itself seemed to emanate a soft, impossible light, as if woven from something not quite of this world. But it was her face that froze the blood in his veins. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow sockets, empty voids that somehow seemed to stare directly into his soul. The colonel stood paralyzed, his military training abandoned in the face of this impossibility. The figure did not speak, did not move toward him. She simply stood there, her eyeless gaze fixed upon him, before slowly drifting backward and fading into the shadows of the corridor. When Loftus finally regained his composure, he rushed back to his chambers, convincing himself that exhaustion and perhaps too much port had conjured this nightmare from his imagination. The following night, the colonel decided to test his sanity. He positioned himself in the same corridor at the same hour, accompanied this time by another guest whose name has been lost to history, but whose presence served as a witness to what would unfold. And she appeared again. The brown lady materialized before them both, wearing the same glowing brown dress, her face bearing those terrible empty sockets where eyes should have been. This second sighting eliminated any possibility of hallucination or dream. Two men, both fully awake and alert, watched as the apparition stood before them for what felt like an eternity before vanishing once more. Colonel Loftus would later provide a detailed description that would become the template against which all future sightings would be measured. He described the dress as being of a rich brown brocade, clearly from another era, perhaps the early 1700s. The fabric seemed to glow with an inner light, brownish in tone, creating an aura around the figure. But it was always the face that dominated his account. The empty eye sockets were not simply dark, he insisted, but somehow deeper than darkness, as if one could fall into them and never find bottom. The rest of her features remained visible, a pale face framed by period-appropriate hair, but those hollow eyes transformed what might have been a beautiful visage into something profoundly disturbing. What made the colonel's testimony particularly compelling was his reputation. This was not a young romantic prone to Gothic fantasies, nor a superstitious servant eager to embellish local legends. This was a decorated military officer, a man of science and reason, who had nothing to gain and much to lose by reporting such an encounter. Yet report it he did, in careful, measured language that spoke to his credibility. He made no claims about the ghost's identity, offered no supernatural explanations. He simply stated what he had seen on 2 consecutive nights, with a witness to corroborate the second encounter. 1 year later, in 1836, Captain Frederick Marryat arrived at Raynham Hall. Marryat was himself a fascinating figure, a Royal Navy officer who had turned to writing and achieved considerable success with his nautical novels. He was known for his sharp wit, his skepticism of supernatural claims, and his tendency to debunk what he considered to be superstitious nonsense. When told of the Brown Lady legend and Colonel Loftus's recent sighting, Marryat reportedly laughed and declared the whole thing to be imaginative rubbish. He would, he announced, be delighted to sleep in the most haunted room in the house and prove once and for all that ghosts were nothing more than shadows and suggestion. His hosts accommodated his request with some reluctance, and Marryat settled into his chambers with a pistol placed beneath his pillow. Not because he believed in ghosts, he assured everyone, but because he suspected pranksters might attempt to stage an apparition to fool the famous skeptic. He was prepared, he said, to expose any such chicanery. The encounter, when it came, was not in his bedroom, but in the corridor outside. Marryat had been visiting with friends in another part of the house, and as he made his way back to his quarters in the early morning hours, he found himself face to face with the Brown Lady. According to his own account, given both verbally and later in written form, he saw a woman in a brown dress approaching him down the corridor. The dress glowed with that same otherworldly light that Colonel Loftus had described. As she drew closer, Marryat saw her face and understood, with a shock that overrode his skepticism, that this was no prank or trick of light. What happened next has become one of the most dramatic moments in the history of paranormal investigation. Marryat, acting on military instinct, and perhaps attempting to prove the apparition was somehow a physical trick, drew his pistol and fired directly at the figure. The report of the gunshot echoed through Raynham Hall, bringing servants and guests running from their rooms. They found Captain Marryat standing in the corridor, his pistol still smoking, staring at the spot where the Brown Lady had been. The apparition had vanished at the moment of firing, but when investigators examined the corridor, they found something remarkable. The bullet was embedded in the heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway, directly behind the spot where the Brown Lady had stood. The trajectory was perfect, the bullet hole precisely where one would expect if Marryat had indeed fired through the space occupied by the ghostly figure. The apparition had offered no resistance to the bullet, no physical substance to slow or deflect it. She had simply not been there in any material sense, even as she remained visible to Marryat's eyes. Captain Marryat, the confirmed skeptic, never wavered in his account of this encounter. He had seen her, he insisted, as clearly as he could see any living person. He had fired at her, and the bullet had passed through empty air. He offered no supernatural explanation, seemed almost embarrassed by the incident, but could not and would not deny what he had witnessed. For a man of his reputation to admit to such an encounter spoke volumes about the reality of his experience. The decades that followed brought additional witnesses, each adding their testimony to the growing body of evidence. In 1926, a woman named Lucia C. Stone stayed at Raynham Hall and reported seeing the brown lady on the main staircase. Stone's description matched those given nearly a century earlier with uncanny precision. The same brown brocade dress, the same luminous quality to the fabric, the same horrifying empty eye socket. Stone had known nothing of the previous sightings when she arrived at Raynham Hall. She was simply a guest, invited for a country weekend. Yet her encounter and subsequent description aligned perfectly with accounts given by witnesses who had been dead for generations. Perhaps most compelling of all was the admission by Lord Charles Townshend himself that he had seen the brown lady as a child. The Townshend family, owners of Raynham Hall and descendants of the second Viscount Townshend, who had married Dorothy Walpole, had lived with the legend for generations. Many family members dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense, embarrassing tales that reflected poorly on their sophisticated household. Yet, Lord Charles, speaking in his later years, quietly confessed that he too had encountered her. As a boy, wandering the halls of his ancestral home, he had seen the woman in brown with the terrible empty eyes. He had told no one at the time, afraid of being mocked or punished for telling tales. But the memory had stayed with him across the decades, as vivid in his old age as it had been in his childhood. What emerges from these accounts is a pattern that defies easy dismissal. These were not peasants sharing folklore around a fire, embellishing tales with each telling. These were educated, often skeptical individuals from different eras, different backgrounds, with no connection to one another. Colonel Loftus did not know Captain Marryat. Lucia C. Stone had never met either of them. Lord Charles Townshend's childhood encounter preceded some of the sightings and followed others, placing him in the middle of a timeline that spanned more than a century. Yet, their descriptions remained remarkably consistent. The brown brocade dress that seemed to glow with inner light, the period styling suggesting the early 1700s, the pale face with its horrifying empty eye sockets, the silent, watchful presence, the tendency to appear in corridors and on staircases, the slow fading rather than sudden disappearance. These details repeated across witness statements given by people who had no opportunity to coordinate their stories or influence each other's perceptions. Equally significant was the pattern of skepticism preceding belief. Colonel Loftus had no particular interest in ghosts before his encounter. Captain Marryat actively mocked the idea and came to Raynham Hall specifically to debunk the legend. These were not individuals predisposed to supernatural experiences or eager to claim contact with the spirit world. They were, if anything, resistant to such ideas, making their eventual testimony all the more powerful. Something at Raynham Hall had overcome their skepticism, had presented itself with such undeniable clarity that they had no choice but to acknowledge what they had seen, regardless of how it contradicted their understanding of reality. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, through these credible witnesses and consistent descriptions, had transcended the realm of mere legend and entered something closer to documented phenomenon. December 9, 1936, dawned cold and unremarkable over the Norfolk countryside. Captain Hubert C. Provan maneuvered his vehicle through the gates of Raynham Hall with the practiced efficiency of a man who had photographed dozens of England's great estates. Beside him sat his assistant, Indre Shira, a trained photographer in his own right. They were there on assignment for Country Life magazine, Britain's most prestigious publication devoted to architecture, estates, and the refined pursuits of the upper classes. Their task was straightforward, almost mundane in its simplicity. They were to photograph the interior of Raynham Hall for an upcoming feature, capturing the grandeur of the Townshend family seat with the technical precision that had made Prouvan's reputation unassailable in the field of architectural photography. Captain Prouvan was no amateur with a box camera hoping to capture oddities in the shadows. He had served his country, earned his rank, and built a career on reliability and technical excellence. His photographic studio on Dover Street in London catered to discerning clients who demanded perfection. Country Life had employed him repeatedly because his work was beyond reproach. Every angle calculated, every exposure measured, every print developed with meticulous care. Indra Shira, his assistant, understood the equipment as well as Pruvand himself. Together, they formed a professional team whose credibility rested on documentation, not imagination. Neither man had any interest in ghosts. The subject had never come up in their professional discussions. They had no connection to the spiritualist movements that still lingered in Britain after the Great War. No fascination with the supernatural, no reason whatsoever to seek out paranormal phenomena. They were craftsmen, technicians, men of the modern age armed with cameras and flashbulbs. The assignment at Raynham Hall was work, nothing more. Another estate, another set of rooms to document, another paycheck from a reputable publication. They had photographed libraries, ballrooms, dining halls, and countless staircases before. This would be no different. Or so they believed. The morning progressed as planned. Room after room fell before their methodical approach. Pruvand positioned the large format camera on its heavy tripod, made his calculations, considered the light. Shira prepared the flash equipment, that essential tool for illuminating the dim interiors of centuries-old buildings. The technology was relatively new, temperamental, requiring careful handling. A single-use flashbulb would ignite magnesium powder, producing an intense burst of light that lasted only a fraction of a second, but was bright enough to properly expose the photographic plate. It was precise work, demanding coordination between the two men. Pruvand would open the shutter, Shira would trigger the flash, and the image would be captured. By early afternoon, they had made their way to the oak staircase. This magnificent structure rose from the ground floor in a graceful sweep of carved oak, darkened by centuries to a deep brown that drank in what little light penetrated the mullioned windows. The Townshend family had walked these steps for generations. It was exactly the sort of architectural feature that country life readers would appreciate, a testament to Stuart-era craftsmanship and aristocratic continuity. Pruvand studied it with his professional eye, considering angles and composition. They decided on a position looking upward, capturing the full sweep of the staircase as it ascended into shadow. The camera was positioned. Pruvand made his adjustments, peering through the ground glass at the inverted image. Shira prepared the flash apparatus, holding it at the proper distance, ready to trigger it at Pruvand's signal. The hall around them was quiet, that particular silence of old houses in the afternoon, when even the servants are occupied elsewhere, and the building seems to hold its breath. Neither man was thinking about the brown lady. Neither was contemplating legend or folklore. They were simply doing their job. Shira stood ready with the flash equipment, his attention focused on the technical task at hand. Then something changed in the air around them. The temperature seemed to shift, though Shira would later struggle to explain precisely what he felt. It was not a draft, not a chill exactly, but a presence, an awareness of movement where no movement should be. He looked up from his equipment toward the top of the oak staircase, and what he saw froze him for a crucial instant. Descending the stairs toward them was a form that defied immediate comprehension. It was not solid, not quite transparent, but something in between. A vaporous shape that nonetheless held a distinctly human outline. The figure moved with purpose, gliding down the steps in a manner that suggested both substance and ethereality. In that fragment of a second, Shira's professional training warred with his instinctive disbelief. His eyes registered details his mind wanted to reject. The form appeared to be a woman, dressed in what seemed to be old-fashioned clothing, and where her face should have been, there was a quality of light that was different from the surrounding shadows, a kind of luminescence that made no logical sense in the dim hallway. He found his voice and shouted to Pruvand. Not a scream of terror, but a photographer's urgent command. "Take the picture. Take it now." Pruvand later recalled hearing the unusual urgency in his assistant's voice. He could not see what Shira saw. His head was beneath the dark cloth, his eye to the viewfinder, his hand already moving to open the shutter. But he trusted his assistant's judgment. In that split second, professional instinct overrode curiosity. If Shira said to shoot, they would shoot. Pruvand opened the shutter. Shira triggered the flash. The magnesium powder ignited with that characteristic sharp crack and blinding white light that turned the dim stairwell into a stark landscape of illuminated wood and deep shadow. For that fraction of a second, Everything was visible in merciless detail. Then darkness rushed back in, leaving both men blinking away, the afterimage burned onto their retinas. The acrid smell of the spent flash hung in the air. Their ears rang slightly from the explosive sound in the confined space. Shira was breathing hard. He described to Pruvand what he had seen, the words tumbling out in a rush. A figure, a woman, descending the stairs toward them, vaporous yet distinct, unlike anything he had seen before. Pruvand had not seen it himself, had been focused entirely on the camera. But he had the plate. Whatever had or had not been on that staircase would be recorded on the light-sensitive emulsion, captured with the same technical precision that had documented 100 unremarkable architectural features that day. They stood for a moment in the settling quiet, the smell of magnesium still sharp in their nostrils. The staircase before them was empty. No figure, no movement, nothing but carved oak and shadow. Shira's pulse gradually slowed. The rational explanations began to suggest themselves. A trick of the light, perhaps. A reflection of some kind. The stress of holding the flash equipment. The strain on the eyes in the dim interior. He was a trained photographer, not a superstitious villager. There had to be a logical explanation. But the image was on the plate. That much was certain. They would develop it in Pruvand's studio in London, under controlled conditions, using the same chemicals and techniques they employed for every other photograph. And then they would know. When the plate was developed, what emerged from the chemical bath silenced their doubts. There on the staircase, captured with the same clarity as the oak paneling and carved balusters, was the unmistakable outline of a figure. It appeared to be descending toward the camera, a luminous form that seemed to possess both substance and transparency. The face was clearly visible, or rather, the area where a face should be glowed with an inexplicable light. The clothing suggested an earlier era. The proportions were human, the posture natural. This was not a smudge or a light leak, not a chemical stain or accidental double exposure. It was an image of something that had been on that staircase with them. Pruvand and Shira faced an excruciating decision. They could destroy the plate, tell no one, complete their assignment with the conventional architectural photographs that country life expected. Their reputations would remain intact, their professional credibility unquestioned. Or they could present the evidence, knowing full well the storm of controversy it would unleash. In an era when spirit photography had been thoroughly debunked, when the frauds and hoaxes of the spiritualist movement had been repeatedly exposed, claiming to have accidentally photographed a ghost was professional suicide, they chose truth over safety. The photograph was presented to Country Life magazine, along with their sworn testimonies detailing exactly what had occurred on the oak staircase. Captain Pruvand's statement was measured and precise. He described the technical specifications of the equipment, the procedures followed, the fact that he himself had not seen the figure but had taken the photograph at his assistant's urgent direction. Indra Shira's testimony was more dramatic, but no less careful. He described the vaporous form, the urgent certainty that they needed to capture it, the split-second decision to call for the shot. Both men understood what they were risking. Pruvand had built his career on reliability. Clients hired him because they could trust his work to be accurate, undoctored, professionally executed. Shira's future in photography depended on his association with a reputable studio. Neither man had anything to gain from fabricating such a story. The payment from Country Life for the article would be the same whether the ghost photograph was included or not. There was no financial incentive, no pending book deal, no lecture circuit waiting to capitalize on their claim. Instead, there was very real danger of professional ruin, of becoming known as the photographers who claimed to have seen ghosts, of having their credibility questioned on every future assignment. Country Life published the photograph in their Christmas issue of 1936, along with the testimonies. The response was immediate and explosive. This was not some anonymous snapshot produced by unknown enthusiasts. This was a professionally captured image by credentialed photographers working on assignment for one of Britain's most respected publications. The photograph itself bore none of the obvious hallmarks of the spirit photographs that had been exposed as frauds in previous decades. There were no obvious double exposures, no theatrical props, no convenient veils or drapery that could be manipulated to suggest ghostly forms. The figure appeared on a staircase being photographed for legitimate architectural documentation. captured in a moment when the photographers had no reason to expect or desire anything unusual. The controversy raged through the winter. Skeptics demanded explanations. Some suggested chemical defects in the plate, though Prouvin's development process was standard, and his other plates from that day showed no abnormalities. Others proposed light leaks or reflections, but the technical examination of the negative revealed no evidence of such error. The more the photograph was analyzed, the more difficult it became to dismiss. This was not easily explained away as a double exposure or a woman in a sheet. This was something captured in the midst of a routine professional assignment by men who had no motive to deceive. Prouvin and Shira maintained their accounts without embellishment or alteration. They gave no interviews to sensationalist publications, made no attempt to profit beyond the original article, offered no additional claims or follow-up revelations. They had seen what they had seen, captured what they had captured, and now faced the professional consequences of their honesty. Their careers survived, though the ghost photograph followed them both for the rest of their lives. Every future assignment came with the unspoken question, the wondering look, the memory of that image on the oak staircase. What makes their testimony compelling is precisely what they had to lose. These were not attention-seeking amateurs or spiritualist believers hoping to prove their faith. They were working photographers who stumbled into something they could not explain while doing the most mundane of assignments. The professional stakes were enormous, the potential for ridicule and professional damage very real. Yet they stood by what they had witnessed and what their camera had recorded. In an age of easy fraud and frequent hoaxes, they offered something rare, credible witnesses with technical expertise, and nothing to gain from deception. The Brown Lady photograph remains one of the most analyzed images in the history of paranormal photography, not because it is the clearest or most dramatic, but because of the circumstances of its capture and the credibility of those who took it. Two professionals on assignment, with witnesses, using equipment they understood completely, capturing an image they neither expected nor desired. Whatever descended the oak staircase that December afternoon in 1936, it was real enough to be photographed. The moment the photograph appeared in Country Life magazine on the first day of December, 1934, Captain Hubert Prouvin and Indra Shira found themselves at the center of an unprecedented forensic investigation. What began as a simple documentation of Raynham Hall's grand staircase had become one of the most scrutinized images in photographic history. Within weeks, experts from across Britain were demanding to examine the negative, and what followed was an analysis that would span decades and eventually reach into the digital age, employing technologies that Prouvin and Shira could never have imagined. The initial examination came swiftly. 1936 marked the first comprehensive technical analysis when a panel of photographic experts convened to study both the original negative and the prints produced from it. These were not casual observers or enthusiastic amateurs, but professionals whose reputations rested on their ability to detect photographic fraud. They brought with them the collective knowledge of an industry that had, by this point, seen every trick and manipulation technique available to photographers of the era. Double exposure was common. Chemical manipulation was well understood. Deliberate staging with living models was perhaps the oldest deception in the photographer's handbook. The experts knew what to look for, and they examined every millimeter of that glass plate negative with professional skepticism. Their findings surprised even themselves. The negative showed no evidence of double exposure, the most common method for creating ghostly images. In a double exposure, a photographer would take one image, then, without advancing the film or changing the plate, take a second image over the first. This technique creates transparent, overlapping figures and had been used since the 1860s to produce spirit photographs. But double exposures leave telltale signs. The overlapping areas show density differences that are measurable. Chemical analysis of the negative's emulsion reveals inconsistencies where one exposure ends and another begins. The experts found none of these markers. The density of the mysterious figure on the staircase was consistent with a single exposure event. They examined the negative for signs of tampering, scrutinizing it for scratches used to draw figures into the emulsion, for chemical applications that might lighten or darken specific areas, for any indication that the image had been altered after the initial exposure. Photographic plates could be painted on, scratched, bleached, or otherwise manipulated to create ghostly effects. The investigators knew these techniques intimately because they had seen them all before. Fraudulent spirit photographers had been exposed throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s using precisely these methods. Yet the Raynham Hall negative showed none of these manipulations. The emulsion was intact. No foreign substances had been applied. No mechanical alterations had been made. Whatever appeared on that staircase had appeared when the shutter opened, not in any darkroom afterward. The 1936 examination also considered the technological limitations of the equipment Prouvand and Shira were using. This was not a modern, sophisticated camera with multiple exposure capabilities or digital manipulation options. This was a traditional large-format camera using glass plate negatives, the kind that had been standard in professional photography for decades. The process was straightforward and unforgiving. You prepared your plate, loaded it into the camera, composed your shot, opened the shutter, exposed the plate to light, and closed the shutter. The chemical process that followed was equally direct. There was no opportunity for the kind of complex trickery that might fool modern film or digital analysis. This technical simplicity became a crucial point in the photograph's defense. Sophisticated fakery in 1934 required sophisticated equipment, and Prouvand and Shira simply did not have it. To create a convincing ghost image that would pass expert examination would have required access to darkroom facilities far beyond what was available to them at Raynham Hall. They would have needed time, privacy, specialized chemicals, and advanced technical knowledge. The photograph was taken during a documented commercial assignment, witnessed by multiple people including Lord Townshend's representative. The timeline and circumstances made elaborate fraud logistically improbable. But skeptics were not satisfied, and as the years passed, new theories emerged to explain the mysterious figure. Some proposed that the image was nothing more than a light reflection, perhaps caused by sunlight entering through a window and bouncing off some reflective surface on or near the staircase. This theory had appeal because it required no supernatural explanation and no fraud. It was simply an accident of light and timing. Photography experts examined this possibility with care, analyzing the angle of the staircase, the position of windows in Raynham Hall, the time of day the photograph was taken, and the quality of light visible in other parts of the image. The light reflection theory encountered immediate problems. The figure on the staircase possessed definition and form that random light reflections do not create. It showed what appeared to be a head, a body, and the suggestion of period clothing. Light reflections create amorphous shapes, bright spots, lens flares. They do not create structured, vertical, human-shaped forms that appear to descend stairs. Moreover, the photograph was taken indoors with controlled lighting provided by the photographer's own equipment. The exposure was carefully calculated for the ambient conditions. A light reflection strong enough to create such a prominent figure would have required an extraordinarily bright, focused light source that would have been immediately apparent to both photographers at the time. Chemical defect theories came next. Perhaps, skeptics argued, the negative had been damaged or had degraded in some way that created the appearance of a figure. Old photographic plates were subject to all manner of chemical deterioration. Moisture could seep in. Emulsions could separate from their glass backing. Silver compounds could oxidize in unexpected patterns. Maybe what everyone was seeing was not a ghost or a fraud, but simply the unfortunate result of chemical instability. Once again, experts examined the negative. They found no evidence of the kinds of damage or degradation that would produce such a specific, formed image. Chemical defects create random patterns, splotches, streaks, and general fogging. They do not create images that appear to be descending staircases in period dress. The most persistent, skeptical theory involved deliberate, long exposure with a model. According to this explanation, someone wearing flowing white clothing deliberately walked down the staircase during a long exposure, creating the translucent, blurred effect. This theory had the advantage of requiring no supernatural explanation, while also accounting for the human shape of the figure. It implied fraud, certainly, but fraud of a technically simple kind. However, this theory ran into multiple obstacles when examined against the known facts. First, Indra Shira was watching the staircase the entire time the photograph was being taken. He saw the figure appear, described it as descending the stairs, and reacted with immediate shock. If a living person had been walking down those stairs, Shira would have seen them with his own eyes, not just through the lens. Second, the exposure time for the photograph, while not instantaneous by modern standards, was not long enough to create the kind of motion blur seen in deliberate long exposure walking photographs. The photographers were documenting architecture, which required sharp, clear images. They used exposure times calculated to freeze detail, not to create artistic motion blur. Third, and perhaps most damning to the model theory, the figure in the photograph does not behave like a person walking during a long exposure. When living subjects move during extended exposures, they create multiple overlapping ghost images or continuous blur trails. The Raynham Hall figure shows neither of these characteristics. It appears as a single cohesive form with internal detail and structure. Photography experts who specialized in long exposure techniques examined the image and concluded that the effect did not match what a walking model would produce. As decades passed and technology advanced, new opportunities for analysis emerged. By the late 20th century, digital scanning and computer-enhanced analysis became possible. The original negative was digitized at extremely high resolution, allowing investigators to examine details invisible to the naked eye. Computer algorithms analyzed the density gradations of the mysterious figure, comparing them to known examples of photographic fraud. Pattern recognition software searched for evidence of manipulation. Digital forensics experts applied techniques developed for criminal investigations and intelligence work. These modern analyses revealed fascinating details but no definitive answers. The digital scans confirmed what the 1936 experts had found. No evidence of double exposure, no signs of mechanical tampering, no chemical manipulation. But the advanced technology also revealed something more subtle and more frustrating. The figure on the staircase showed internal complexity that seemed inconsistent with simple explanations. There were gradations of density within the form, suggestions of facial features, hints of fabric texture. These details were too refined to be random chemical defects, yet too subtle to prove deliberate creation. Some digital analysts noted that the figure showed a slight downward motion blur, consistent with Shira's claim that it appeared to be descending the stairs. This blur pattern matched what would be expected if something luminous was actually moving during the exposure. But was that something a supernatural entity or a cleverly deployed accomplice? The digital analysis could not answer that question. It could only confirm that the blur existed and that its characteristics were consistent with downward motion. Hardcore skeptics continued their attempts at debunking, growing increasingly frustrated with each failure to produce definitive proof of fraud. Some proposed that Pruvand and Shira had used a technique involving projected images, shining a magic lantern slide onto the staircase to create the ghost. Photography experts countered that such projection would require equipment the photographers did not have access to at Raynham Hall, would leave different density characteristics on the negative, and would have been immediately visible to witnesses present during the photo session. Others suggested that the whole event was a carefully planned hoax, involving cooperation from Lord Townshend's staff, elaborate preparation of the staircase, and possibly even construction of some kind of reflective apparatus. But this theory required a conspiracy involving multiple people, none of whom ever came forward to confess or profit from their deception. It required Pruvand and Shira to risk their professional reputations on a stunt that could easily have been exposed. It required planning and resources that seemed grossly disproportionate to any potential benefit. The frustration became mutual. Skeptics could not prove fraud, despite decades of trying. Believers could not prove authenticity beyond establishing that common forms of fakery were not present. The photograph existed in a maddening limbo, neither definitively debunked nor confirmed. Every attempt at explanation, whether supernatural or mundane, encountered obstacles that prevented complete acceptance. This unresolved tension created the perfect mystery. The Brown Lady photograph became a touchstone for discussions about the limits of evidence, the nature of proof, and the persistence of the unexplainable. It demonstrated that even in an age of scientific analysis and technological sophistication, Some images resist definitive categorization. The experts had done their work. The technology had been applied. The theories had been tested. And still, the mysterious figure descends those stairs, captured in silver halide crystals on a glass plate negative, refusing to yield its secrets to either belief or skepticism. The iron gates of Raynham Hall stand closed most days of the year, a barrier between the curious world and one of Britain's most persistently haunted private residences. While other stately homes have embraced their spectral reputations, opening their doors to ghost tours and overnight investigations, Raynham remains determinedly private. The Townshend family still occupies these ancient halls, still walks past the oak staircase where something inexplicable was photographed in 1936, still lives with whatever presence has refused to leave for 3 centuries. But privacy cannot contain phenomena. Stories leak out through the people who must enter: the maintenance workers, the delivery drivers, the rare authorized guests. And what they report suggests that whatever Captain Pruvan's camera captured that September day was not an ending, but evidence of something that continues still. Michael Patterson worked as an electrician at Raynham Hall for nearly 15 years, from 1998 until 2013. His contract required him to sign a non-disclosure agreement about anything he witnessed on the property, a clause he found odd at the time. He understood it better after his first winter working in the house. It was a Tuesday morning in January of 1999 when Patterson first encountered the cold. He had been tasked with checking the wiring in the upper corridors, work that required him to spend considerable time near the oak staircase. The heating system functioned perfectly throughout the rest of the house, but the temperature near that particular staircase dropped so dramatically that his breath came out in visible cloud. He checked his thermometer repeatedly, watching it plunge from a comfortable 18 degrees Celsius elsewhere in the house to barely 4 degrees near the bottom steps. The cold moved. He would later tell researchers who gained permission to speak with him after his retirement. It was not a static phenomenon, not a draft from a window or a gap in the walls. The frigid zone would shift, sometimes concentrating near the top of the staircase, sometimes pooling at the bottom, sometimes spreading to envelop the entire ascending path. Patterson learned to work quickly in those areas, his fingers growing numb even through his gloves. But the cold was only the beginning. On a Thursday afternoon, in March of that same year, Patterson stood alone in the upper hallway, testing wall outlets. He heard footsteps on the oak staircase, the distinct sound of someone descending. Heavy footsteps, he noted, the kind made by substantial shoes on wooden treads. He called out, assuming another worker had entered the area. No one answered. The footsteps continued, measured and deliberate, descending from the upper floor toward where he stood. Patterson walked to the staircase landing and looked down. The steps were empty, completely empty. But the footsteps continued, now passing directly in front of him, continuing down to the ground floor. He stood frozen, listening to the sound of invisible feet moving through space until the footsteps faded into silence somewhere below. He was not the last to hear those phantom steps. Between 2000 and 2020, at least 17 different workers reported the same phenomenon. Always on the oak staircase, always the sound of descent, never ascent. Some heard light, quick footsteps suggesting a woman's gait. Others described heavier, slower movement. But all agreed on one detail. The footsteps were accompanied by a profound sense of being watched, of standing in the presence of something aware and observant. Sarah Chen delivered parcels to Raynham Hall throughout 2015 and 2016. As a driver for a national courier service, she had been to hundreds of historic homes and private estates. None affected her like Raynham. During her very first delivery, standing in the entrance hall while waiting for someone to sign for a package, she felt what she described as invisible eyes boring into the back of her neck. She turned, expecting to find someone standing behind her. The hall was empty, but the sensation intensified, becoming so overwhelming that she nearly dropped the package she held. It felt, she said in a later interview, like being examined by something that saw far more than her physical form, something that looked through her and into her. Chen made approximately 30 deliveries to Raynham Hall during her 2 years on that route. The sensation of being watched occurred during roughly half of those visits, always in the same areas: the entrance hall, the corridor leading toward the oak staircase, and once, memorably, in the ground floor library. That final experience proved so unnerving that she requested a route change, abandoning the lucrative delivery contract rather than continue visiting the house. What did she experience in the library? She remained reluctant to discuss it in detail, but offered this. She had been asked to place a delivery just inside the library door, while the house manager attended to something elsewhere. As she set down the box, she glanced toward the far corner of the room and saw, for just a moment, a figure standing there. A woman in dark clothing, partially obscured by shadow. Chen blinked, and the figure vanished. But in that brief instant of visibility, she saw the woman's face, or rather, the suggestion of a face with hollow, dark places where eyes should have been. Chen left the package, left the house, and sat in her van for 20 minutes before she could trust herself to drive. The rare visitors who gain authorized access to Raynham Hall often arrive as academics, architectural historians, or art specialists examining the house's considerable collection of paintings and period furnishings. Most complete their work without incident, but a significant minority report experiences that defy conventional explanation. Professor David Marsh visited Raynham in October of 2008 to examine the family's collection of 18th century portraiture. His credentials were impeccable: 30 years teaching art history at Cambridge, numerous published works on Georgian-era painting, no history of belief in paranormal phenomena. He approached his 3-day visit to Raynham as he had approached dozens of similar research trips, with professional detachment and scholarly focus. On his second evening, working late to photograph a series of portraits in the upper gallery, Marsh experienced what he described as a complete electronic failure. His digital camera, fully charged an hour earlier, died suddenly. His backup camera failed moments later. The lights in the gallery began to flicker, though the bulbs had just been replaced and the electrical system had been recently updated. Then his phone stopped working, the screen going dark despite showing 80% battery charge before the failure. Marsh stood in the flickering light, surrounded by dead electronics, and felt the temperature plummet. The cold descended like a wave, so intense and so sudden that he gasped. And in that moment, in the unstable light, he saw movement at the end of the gallery. A shape, he said. A human-shaped darkness that seemed to absorb the little light available, creating a hole in the visible world. He left the gallery immediately, his professional composure abandoned. When he retrieved his equipment the next morning, every device functioned perfectly. His cameras powered on with their batteries showing full charges. His phone worked normally. He completed his research project, but declined to spend another night in the house, commuting instead from a hotel 15 miles away. When investigators later examined the photographs he had taken, they found something unexpected on the images captured just before his equipment failed. In 3 consecutive shots of a portrait depicting the second Marquess Townshend, a strange luminous mist appeared at the edge of the frame. The mist was not present in earlier photos of the same portrait taken from the same angle. It appeared suddenly, grew denser across the 3 images, then vanished. Marsh had not noticed any mist while taking the photographs. The family's general reluctance to discuss the hauntings publicly has made systematic investigation difficult, but not impossible. On 3 occasions, the Townshends have permitted limited paranormal research within Raynham Hall. The investigations occurred in 2003, 2011, and 2017, each conducted by different teams under strict conditions. No media presence, no publication of findings without family approval, access limited to specific areas, and specific time frame. The 2003 investigation, led by researchers from the Society for Psychical Research, focused primarily on the oak staircase and the surrounding corridors. The team brought standard investigation equipment: electromagnetic field detectors, digital thermometers, audio recorders, and infrared cameras. They were granted access for 3 consecutive nights, from 10 in the evening until 5 in the morning. The electromagnetic readings proved immediately anomalous. EMF detectors registered significant field fluctuations in areas with no electrical wiring, no obvious sources of electromagnetic radiation. The fields would spike suddenly, register readings 3 to 4 times baseline levels, then drop back to normal with no discernible pattern. The strongest and most frequent spikes occurred on the oak staircase itself, particularly on the lower steps where the brown lady had been photographed 67 years earlier. Temperature monitoring revealed the same mobile cold zones that electrician Michael Patterson had described. Thermographic cameras captured dramatic temperature differentials, showing areas of intense cold moving through otherwise warm spaces. On the second night, one researcher stood on the staircase landing with a handheld thermometer and watched the temperature drop 14 degrees in less than 30 seconds, then rise back to normal almost as quickly. The cold, she reported, felt directed, purposeful, as though something was manifesting specifically around her position. The audio recordings proved most unsettling. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, refers to sounds captured on recording devices that were not audible to human ears at the time of recording. The Raynham investigation produced dozens of potential EVP recordings, most too unclear or ambiguous to draw firm conclusions. But 3 recordings from the oak staircase presented sounds that defied easy dismissal. The first, recorded at 12:43 on the second night, captured what sounds distinctly like a woman's voice saying a single word. The word remains disputed among researchers who have analyzed the recording. Some hear leave, others interpret it as hear. The voice quality suggests age, a rasping, breathless quality that raises the hair on the back of the neck when heard. The second recording, from 3:17 on the third night, contains a series of sounds that investigators described as fabric rustling, as though someone in a long dress was moving past the microphone. No one was near the device when the sounds were recorded. The audio also captured what might be footsteps, faint but rhythmic, ascending the stairs. The third recording remains the most controversial. At 4:32 on the final morning, with dawn approaching and the investigation nearly concluded, multiple audio devices captured the same sound simultaneously. A low moan or cry. Undeniably human in character, filled with what investigators described as profound sadness or despair. The sound lasted approximately 7 seconds, rose and fell in pitch, then ceased abruptly. Every researcher present heard this sound with their own ears, not just on playback. It seemed to emanate from the staircase itself, from the wood and air and shadows. One team member, a researcher named Helen Pritchard, with 15 years of investigation experience, wept when she heard it. She later explained that the sound conveyed such absolute misery, such hopeless grief, that her emotional response was involuntary and overwhelming. The 2011 investigation took a more technical approach, employing updated equipment including full-spectrum cameras, ion counters, and advanced sound analysis software. This team gained access to additional areas of the house, including the bedroom traditionally identified as the Brown Lady's chambers. The findings echoed and expanded upon the earlier investigation's results. Ion counter readings showed significant negative ion concentrations in areas where phenomena were reported, a finding some researchers associate with paranormal activity, though the interpretation remains scientifically controversial. Full-spectrum photography captured several images containing anomalies, unexplained light formations, shadow shapes that appeared solid in infrared but invisible to normal vision. And in one startling photograph taken in the upper corridor, what appears to be a partial human figure ascending the oak staircase. The figure in that photograph remains a subject of intense debate. It shows what could be interpreted as a woman's form from approximately the waist down, the image semi-transparent but distinct. The dress, if it is a dress, appears to be from a much earlier era, with the kind of full skirts popular in the 18th century. The photograph was taken at 2:27 in the morning by a motion-triggered camera. No living person was present in the corridor at that time. All team members were accounted for in other parts of the house. Skeptics point to numerous possible explanations: camera malfunction, light refraction, deliberate hoax. Proponents note that the camera was new, functioning properly before and after the image was captured, and that the investigation was conducted under controlled conditions with no incentive for fabrication. The debate continues. The most recent permitted investigation in 2017 brought neuroscientist Dr. Amanda Foster to Raynham Hall with specialized equipment designed to measure infrasound, electromagnetic fields, and what she termed environmental factors that might trigger hallucinogenic experiences. Dr. Foster approached the investigation from a skeptical perspective, hypothesizing that reported hauntings might result from natural phenomena causing psychological effects in witnesses. Her findings complicated that hypothesis. While she did identify some environmental factors that could theoretically influence perception, including minor infrasound readings in certain areas, These factors were insufficient to explain the range and consistency of reported phenomena. Moreover, her equipment registered anomalies she could not explain through conventional environmental science. Most significantly, Dr. Foster herself experienced an event that challenged her skeptical framework. On her final night at Raynham, working alone near the oak staircase at approximately 3 in the morning, she saw what she described as a luminous shape on the stairs. The shape was vaguely human in form, predominantly white or pale gray in color, and appeared to be descending the staircase. Dr. Foster watched it for approximately 15 seconds before it faded from visibility. Her immediate physiological response was measurable. Her heart rate increased from a resting 72 beats per minute to 108. Her skin temperature dropped 2 degrees. These changes were recorded by biometric equipment she wore as part of her study. The environmental sensors showed simultaneous electromagnetic spikes and a temperature drop of 9 degrees localized to the staircase area. Dr. Foster's published paper on the investigation carefully avoided declaring Raynham Hall genuinely haunted, but concluded that the phenomena reported there deserved serious scientific attention and could not be dismissed as simple misperception or fabrication. So the question remains hanging in the air of those corridors like the mysterious cold that comes and goes. Does the brown lady still walk the oak staircase? Was the 1936 photograph a singular moment, a once-in-a-century alignment of circumstances that allowed the invisible to be seen? Or did Captain Prouvan's camera capture evidence of something that repeats year after year, decade after decade, century after century? The current Marquess Townshend, when asked about the hauntings in a rare 2019 interview, offered only this carefully worded statement. Many people have lived within these walls, and many have died here. The house holds its memories in its own way. But the maintenance workers know. The delivery drivers know. The investigators who have walked those corridors in the deepest hours of night know. Something remains at Raynham Hall. Something that makes its presence felt through cold and sound, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that exist somewhere beyond normal sight. Whatever Dorothy Walpole became in death, whatever tragedy or injustice bound her to this place, whatever force or consciousness manifests on that staircase, it has not departed. It has not found rest. The brown lady walks still, seen by some, sensed by many, photographed once in an image that remains unexplained after 8 decades, and the oak staircase waits in shadow, beautiful and terrible, marked forever by that September day when the invisible became visible, when 2 photographers captured something that should not exist but undeniably does, something that walks between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, forever descending, forever watched, forever watching. 90 years have passed since Captain Hubert Prouvan and Indra Shira climbed the oak staircase at Raynham Hall, and we are no closer to the truth than we were on that September afternoon in 1936. Science has not explained the brown lady photograph. The supernatural has not confirmed it. And so it exists in that uncomfortable space between worlds, neither proven nor debunked, neither embraced nor dismissed, a photographic ghost that haunts the very boundary between what we know and what we fear. If Dorothy Walpole is the brown lady, if that glowing figure truly represents the consciousness of a woman who died nearly 300 years ago, then we must ask the questions that have no answers. Why does she walk? Is she searching through endless corridors for the children who were torn from her arms, babies she barely knew before Charles Townshend sent them away? Or is she forever trying to escape the room where she was locked away, imprisoned by a husband's jealousy and rage, her feet endlessly attempting a flight that ended centuries ago? What keeps a spirit tethered to the scene of its suffering? What prevents it from finding whatever peace awaits beyond? And why did the phenomenon peak when it did? The Victorian era brought a flood of sightings, guests fleeing in terror, house guests refusing to sleep in certain rooms. The 1930s brought the photograph itself, the single piece of potential evidence that changed everything. But then, the sightings diminished. The brown lady grew quiet. The oak staircase stood empty. Does a haunting have a life cycle? Do ghosts fade as memory fades? Or did something change at Raynham Hall, some shift in energy or attention that allowed whatever walked those halls to finally rest? We may never know if Prouvan and Shira captured genuine evidence of life after death, or simply witnessed a perfect storm of coincidence and optical phenomena. Light through stained glass at precisely the right angle, movement during a long exposure, chemical anomalies in film development. The skeptics offer these explanations, and they are not unreasonable. But they require their own form of faith, a belief in impossible timing, in countless variables aligning to create an image that looks exactly like what witnesses had been describing for generations. What the photograph truly represents may have nothing to do with ghosts at all. Perhaps it reveals humanity's desperate need to prove that consciousness survives death, that the people we love continue beyond the grave, that we ourselves will not simply cease to exist. Or perhaps it shows our willingness to see patterns in chaos, to find faces in shadows, to transform random noise into meaningful signals, because the alternative, true randomness and ultimate silence, is too terrible to accept. The oak staircase still stands in Norfolk. Tourists walk those steps. Photographers attempt to recreate the image. Paranormal investigators bring their equipment, hoping to capture what Prouvand and Shira did, hoping to add one more piece of evidence to the puzzle. But the brown lady does not appear on command. She never has. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, something descended those stairs on September 19, 1936, and was captured forever on film. Something moved. Something glowed. Something existed in that moment between one exposure and the next. And we who remain, we who study the photograph and debate its meaning, we are left with only questions. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. Some photographs aren't meant to be explained. And some staircases, perhaps, aren't meant to be walked alone. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.